to grow and sustain itself in order for everybody to succeed. As we've learned over the last 12 months, we've all really had to evolve and adapt. And you're still probably making plans to grow or pivot your business. Our team of advisors here at Northwestern Mutual help to make that happen with a financial plan specifically designed around your vision. From initial startup to people who are looking to pass their business down the road, you have a trusted partner and a financial plan to back you up and help answer any questions that most business leaders struggle with in this process. A couple of those things are, how do I attract and retain key employees now and when I exit my business? How will my business continue to thrive if something happens to me, to my partner, or to a key team member on our team? Who am I going to sell my business to, and what's the best way to transition or transfer that business? And lastly, when do I want to retire? And when I do retire, how do I start paying myself back? Or how do I start paying myself an income? At times, when so many are counting on you, you'll have a team that you can count on that can help you through some of these steps. And since you're in control of your money at any stage of your business, you'll have more opportunities to focus on the bigger things in your business and life. If you need any clarity around any of these questions that I've laid out today, or if you have any additional questions regarding your business or how to retain your key employees or how to take care of the transfer process, feel free to let us know here at Northwestern Mutual. You can email me specifically at clint.brady@nm.com, and I can connect you with one of our top business-focused advisors here in our office. We thank all of you for being here. We're proud to be a part of the business support programming. Small business are a vital piece to our community, and we want to keep helping them grow and transfer to the next generation. With that said, I want to welcome our speakers today. First, we have Ginny. Ginny is a principal with Praxis Consulting Group and is the firm's immediate past president, a position in which she served for 21 years since co-founding the firm. Praxis works with companies to align leadership, culture, and strategy to enhance organizational performance. She has more than 30 years of experience assisting companies in areas of leadership development and strengthening organizational cultures so they maximize the opportunities that come with greater employee engagement. A major focus of her work during the last 15 years has been designing and delivering leadership development programs that deepen each company's leadership capacity. Ginny is published widely in both her trade and peer-reviewed journals. In addition to her work at Praxis, Ginny is a faculty member of the graduate program in Dynamics of Organization at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses on organizational change. She is the founder and academic director of a unique leadership development program for current and incoming CEOs/presidents of employee-owned companies. Jeannie holds a BS and an MS degree from Cornell University and a PhD in social psychology of groups and organizations from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Everyone, please welcome Ginny. All right, and our next speaker is Daniel Goldstein, and he's president and COO of Foliance. I don't know if I said that right, Daniel.
Yes.
He has 25 years of executive leadership experience that spans 5 continents and an irresistible wanderlust that's carried him to more than 50 countries. It's a spirit of exploration that's essential as Daniel shares Foliance with the world in his role as the chief ambassador and educator. Daniel also guides investment strategy, which includes acquiring, integrating, and advising each of the brands in the Foliance portfolio. Everyone, please welcome Daniel. Thank you, guys. Take it away.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting us. And I guess one of the things to say before I pull up my slides is just that Daniel and I have worked together for the last 6 years. And so we're delighted to both do this and do this together. We're going to look at 2 different parts of succession, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we'll probably interrupt each other and add to each other's presentations. So with that, let me pull this up. All right, come on, there we are. Okay. Again, thanks for inviting me, Jamie. I'm delighted to be here. And so it is one of the silver linings of COVID, right? When we have the ability to be anywhere without having to get on a plane and travel, as well as learning to do everything we used to do and think we could only do in person. We now are doing on Zoom. So this feels unfortunately very familiar to be on this particular platform. Anyway, today, Daniel and I are going to cover these two different succession issues and challenges. One is the succession of key staff and thinking about that in terms of how do you prepare for that and plan for it, whether it's anticipated or not anticipated that somebody leaves. And then Daniel's going to talk about ownership succession. Like how do you think about the ownership succession of your company? So I think hopefully these both are aligned with what you were expecting, because this is what we're going to do. And then we're gonna pay attention to questions in the chat. We probably will answer them. If we know we're coming up on them later, we won't answer them right away, but we will have more of a discussion at the end of the presentations. Daniel, do you want to add anything before I sort of dive into this?
Dive away.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with some of the common approaches to succession. I don't know if you ever imagined an approach like this or heard of one. And then if you don't like that one, there's this one, which we see far too often. We call it the uh-oh approach to succession. So hopefully neither of these feel really familiar to you. Oops, hold on. Next slide.
And of course, the other type of succession is when nature provides the motivation for it, which is usually not a good one too.
No, right. That's it. That's exactly right. So I think the big question, it is sort of the why bother question, because it takes a lot of time, right? It takes some focus. It often takes emotional energy to imagine like, oh, I'm going to leave, or at some point I'm going to retire, but I'm not really ready. So should I be thinking about this? So why should you bother? And really there's two big reasons, right? As far as we're concerned, there's the defensive reason, which is, things happen, often unplanned, right? It might be anticipated, but maybe not. Right. And I think that we see far too much of the unanticipated leaving of people who are in key positions, not just CEOs, but your chief, your senior vice president of sales, right? Or your senior HR person. And when those things happen, your company gets disrupted. You may or may not be able to find somebody. You may or may not have somebody internally that's ready to step in, so that really that one of the ideas of succession planning ahead of time, not just like, oh, I know I'm going to leave in 2 years, but like even earlier than that, is to be thinking about and planning for like, what would happen if anybody in any key role left because maybe something bad happened, as Daniel suggests, or perhaps their partner moves somewhere else and they can't be doing the job remotely, even though, of course, you can do a lot more jobs remotely now than we used to think you could do. So the idea is about minimizing risk. And frankly, your board should all be asking you about this. Your board should be saying, one of the things boards worry about is risk, right? Are you protected? And so asking you if you've got a succession plan is one of the things we often see and we encourage boards to be doing. And that really means more than like, tell me who are the 5 people in the list in your desk that you think if something happened to you could take over. That's not really a succession plan. That's like a disaster plan. And you should have one of those as well. But we're talking about if something ends up happening, there's somebody ready to step in, right? Because you've developed them over time. So that's the defensive strategy. There's also an offensive reason to do this. And that's that if you really are thinking about developing people, then you're going to build your leadership capacity across your firm, right? You're going to have more people who are stronger. And you may have people that are really ready to just step in. Because they've been being developed over time, even if not for a specific role, but they've got a lot of the skills and capabilities and competencies they need as leaders. So that is nothing but good for your company, right? All right. Let me do this. Okay. So there are some general principles that we like to think of when we think about succession. And one, basically is this. It's like succession, we don't think is a one-time thing, right? It's actually, when you do it well, it's a system. It's not a plan. It's not a plan for what are you going to do when the CEO leaves, which is mostly when people start to think about it, right? But rather it's a system that involves, developing, kind of having a culture of developing leaders all the time in your company. Right. And what that means is that could mean a couple of different things, right? That could mean that you're developing specific people who you think are potentially successors for critical roles, or it could mean developing a whole cohort of people, maybe the next tier of leadership below the C-suite, or maybe people even further down that have high potential. And that you're developing them in an ongoing way. So, each year, they learn new competencies, or even a more coherent program that's going on regularly throughout your company. But in both cases, one of the pieces that's really important and that we see often missing in companies is a requirement and an expectation for managers that they be developing at least two people who could become successors for their job. Why two people, right? Why two people? Because oftentimes you focus on one person, and that person, it turns out somebody else offers them something, some kind of a better deal or a different position, or their partner moves somewhere, and then you've spent a lot of time and energy and you don't have anybody in place. So in our view, it's better to be developing at least two people for every crucial position in your firm on an ongoing basis, with the idea that really you're, again, increasing your leadership capacity. And if you're growing, there will become the positions for those people will emerge. So you don't have to tell them you're the appointed successor. All I have to tell them is we think you've got a lot of leadership capacity, and we're going to invest in developing you. All right. So let's talk about how you begin a succession system, right? And that's this way. You have to start with a strategic plan or some clear sense of where you're going, how you're growing. You may need a different kind of person or different kinds of people if you're going to grow by acquisition than if you're going to grow by evolution, right? Or grow organically. So what are you going to do? How, where do you sort of see your company going is one of the first things to think about, because that starts to tell you what kind of leaders might you need in the future. How might you think about developing people so that they can be those kinds of leaders, and so forth. The second thing is that you want to, sorry, let me go back. Whoa, wrong way. You want to rethink your structure on a regular basis. Do we have the right roles, right, in our organization? Or have we got a role that actually now needs to be split into two because we've grown and it's too much for one person to do? Or we need to think I've had an HR role, but it's been pretty much transactional. And now we've grown to a stage where we really need an organizational development person that's much more transformational, that can help with the whole restructuring on an ongoing basis and help us manage change in a way that a transactional HR person probably can't. So thinking about what your organization's design looks like helps you identify roles that you may not even have now that you're going to need in the future that you should be developing people for, as well as changes in roles that you have that would suggest that you need to develop people in a different kind of way. And then you have to think about these two things. One is the culture of your organization. And we're big fans of having people, if you've got a culture in your organization that you really care about, that you think is essential for driving your success, then being clear about what that is and what kind of leaders do you need that will support that culture, maintain it, help to grow it. What kind of style do you want them to have, and so forth. That's really important, because new leaders can destroy culture if they're not really the right person pretty quickly. And then then of course the fourth thing is leadership development. Is, are you developing people that can kind of support the culture, potentially fit into some of these roles that you're creating or revising, and help move your strategic plan forward. All right. So thinking about leaders, there are this is sort of the bigger picture of kind of what you're thinking about, or what we would encourage you to be thinking about is this sort of, what's your future plan, the culture, your values, like they're the base. Then what kind of leadership competencies do you need to make sure you have people that can fit into this? And then finally, what are the functional competencies that you need? Like, do you need people that have, M&A experience? How much financial acumen do you need them to have, and so forth? So all of these are important, and sort of thinking about all of them when you're thinking about who could be successors. We think they're all important. Daniel, if you want to add anything at any point, please feel free to step in. You good? Okay.
I'm good.
All right. So the next question is, can you, do you have people internally that you can build through this sort of leadership development, whether it's of individuals or groups? Or do you need to bring in somebody? Do you need to search? Search is one way to do it, right? If you're looking around and you go, oh my goodness, I'm the CEO and I'm leaving in 2 years and we don't have anybody, I better go, hire a search firm, and my board will hire a search firm, to see if we can find somebody. Or the other way we would encourage you to think about it is, if you plan far enough ahead and you don't think you have anybody for any of your key roles who's going to be ready in time, then hire with the future in mind, right? Hire somebody early who you can test out and see if they're going to be able to step into the role you want them for. So you don't have to hire someone into a CEO role. You can hire someone into a executive vice president role, or you can hire them to head a functional area or a business unit and see how they do. And hopefully that'll be successful. And that'll also get them acquainted with your culture, and you'll be able to test out how well they can do. However, I'm going to skip this. Let me go to this. There is some data about this that I think is interesting, just to share this. So internal candidates moving into senior roles, there is the data that shows that they do better. They're more successful. They're 40% of the time, they're more successful than people that you bring in who are external, who tend to fail more often, right? So if you have the possibility, then having internal successors is better for all the reasons that are listed here, right? It provides them with a career path. It gives you continuity within the organization. You know who they are, so you don't have to worry about what they said in the interview is not how they act, right? And we've all, I'm sure experienced that. They read your, most people that are looking for a senior level job have studied your website, and they know what you're looking for, and they can speak to it pretty coherently, but that doesn't mean that that's who they are. So having internal people is often better. On the other hand, we also know that internal people, you can't practice being the CEO, right? So at some level, when you're replacing a CEO, you're making a leap. You're making a leap of faith, and hopefully it's not too big a leap. But people often aren't, they haven't had a chance to be in the job you want to put them in. So there's that. And there's also the fact that, if your organization, for example, is going to start growing now by acquisitions and nobody's done those, then it's going to be hard to say, oh, I've got somebody internally who can do that, right? Because I've developed them, because you haven't really done much with that. So there are times when you have to go external because you need a certain set of skills, you need a certain set of experiences that are going to be helpful to your company. But if you can, then we recommend, developing people internally.
And Ginny, and I just jump in to say that's why it's so important that what you said before, that succession isn't about replacing a person, it's about a system and leadership development, because it starts with people that get promoted are often promoted because of a technical expertise, not because of leadership skills. And so you need to have that leadership development at all levels of the organization so that you do have emerging leaders that bubble up and grow through the organization so that eventually you have that internal succession plan. And so that's why if people were hoping that there's going to be a 3-point checklist for how do you replace the CEO on today's session, not going to happen. It's a lot of hard work. You need to build a system, and it takes time to have a coherent system that will provide for us.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a good way to put it, Daniel. I really do appreciate that. And I will say, I was just thinking about another company that that I have worked with for I don't know, maybe like 8 years, I guess. And in that 8 years, the CEO has had almost a complete turnover of the C-suite, except for the senior HR person. And in every single case, because they've been doing leadership development for that whole 8 years, in every case, they had somebody ready to just sort of smoothly step into the role. And it was amazing to see. They didn't do succession planning per se, but they did a lot of leadership development. So they really were ready. All right. Let's see. All right. So I want to just sort of, trying to move my own thing. I want to talk about some of the succession principles that I think are really important. One of them is this notion of sort of starting far enough ahead of time that you can actually both assess and develop, or maybe it's the other way, develop and assess internal successors. And that really begins with two things. I mean, one is identifying all of the critical positions, right? What's any position in your organization that if somebody left tomorrow, right, you hadn't anticipated it, that it would hurt you, right? It would create some chaos in the firm. It might be a sales position. It could be an HR position. It could be your finance lead, right? It could be anybody. And what does that mean about the roles that you should be sure you've got people in place who could be developed to move in, right? To move into those roles if the need happened. And they might be a couple years away. They might be several years away. And I understand if you're a small firm, that's really hard to do, right? And sometimes we also suggest, like, look across the firm. Don't just look in, don't just look in HR for the next HR leader, right? Could be somewhere else in the firm. But thinking about it on a regular basis of, do we have people? Can we develop them? And if I'm you, I'm thinking, well, wait, like, I'm going to develop them. There's not going to be a role, right? And I guess I would say to that, probably there will be a role, right? There may be new roles. We hope that you're growing, right? You're growing your business enough that there will be people stepping into roles, and you can also expand what people are doing laterally. So we kind of think of it as sideways succession, but they have opportunities to develop by expanding what their responsibilities are. So there are lots of ways to think about that. And then the next thing is this idea about describing positions. This is what Daniel was talking about, like, both today, like, oh, what are the things this person has to do today? But like, what do I think they're going to need to do in the future? Right? What would a person in any of those critical roles, what do we want them to be able to do in 2 to 5 years? So that's not a replacement today. And that's hard, right? That's hard because you're asking your managers to think about succession, and they're like, I want to figure out who's going to be the next me, right? Or they actually don't want to think about who's going to be the next me because, like, does that mean I'm going to leave or something's going to happen to me? So that's like, there's a psychological piece of this that's tricky too. And as I said before, kind of hiring with the future in mind. So as you hire people, thinking not only about, oh, I have this job opening, let me see who I can find that would be great at the job, but also asking yourself, am I finding people that would be both good at the current job, but seem to have the potential that with development, they could move up? And that really has to do with sort of this notion of A players. When you hire A players, they also have the capacity to move, even though it might not be immediate, good for the job today, but potential for the job tomorrow. If you're hiring external candidates or looking at external candidates, we suggest you test them to find out kind of more about who they are, not just kind of how they say that, who they say they are. And as I think I mentioned this earlier, but let me just emphasize it. You can bring people in one position down, or hire them on a project potentially, if they're available, to sort of test out like how they work out in your environment. And again, setting job expectations to develop potential successors, tracking their development, talking about this on a regular basis. The people don't generally like to talk about culture or think about culture when they're thinking about succession, that is the culture of your firm. They mostly think about, oh, like, what are the leadership competencies that we need? And I just want to remind you that, like, the culture of your organization, to the extent either you want somebody who can maintain it, or we also see boards hire people in who will change the culture. There's a specific thing that they want to have happen. But whatever it is, like the importance of thinking about culture, I can't emphasize enough. And then finally, like regularly reviewing kind of who you've got, what positions you've got, what kind of structural or design changes do you need to make, new roles that are emerging, and then adjusting and thinking about, are the people that you're thinking are potential successors, some will fall off your list, some will rise up and be put on your list, and so forth. So that's sort of the summary of principles.
And Jenny, I'd add that when you said some people are nervous about looking at succession for their own position because that makes them think that they're not going to have a role. I've heard it also said, if you don't provide for succession for your own role, then you're not free to move up in the company.
Right.
So there's a little bit of what's in it for you. If you take care of your own succession, then you're free to continue moving up in the company.
Right. That's right. And even if you're not moving up, well, the other thing is that we often say to people, if you've been developing people as successors, you're now going to be moving more to be able to think strategically, right? To do the strategic work that's maybe more interesting at this point. And somebody else can do some of those things that like maybe aren't quite as interesting to you, right? But really interesting to them. So there are some challenges. We have to always talk about challenges. So we'll talk about those for a minute. So I think one of them is making the commitment to systematically develop people. That's a big commitment. And as I said, it takes time, and it's both about what leaders are doing in the organization, how committed they are, and how they build it into the role expectations for managers. And then hold them accountable, which is the next one. So, I work with a CEO, for example, who every year says to everybody who heads any kind of functional area or team, I want you to draw what your organizational structure looks like today. And then I want to see what you think it's going to look like in 3 years. Like if we keep growing the way we are, what are the positions you're going to add? Why do you think you need them? And what do you need sort of first, second, and third? And that's a way that she keeps people who are leaders at any level focused on making sure they're developing people, because then she asks, who's ready, right? If you're going to create these new positions, do you have somebody ready? Do we need to hire, right? And it's now kind of built into the fabric of kind of how they operate as a leadership team. I do think this is a big challenge, this notion of the difficulty of facing the idea of being replaced. And I think our message is to everybody, in any roles, you're going to leave at some point. The question is how and when, right? We're all leaving. So, do you want to plan it? You don't have to, but do you want to be prepared? Yeah. And even people that are, you know, not planning to leave in the near future. So work with some CEOs that are pretty young. We still say you need a succession plan. Maybe your interests will change. Maybe you don't want to do this anymore. Maybe something, hopefully not, will happen to you. You still need to have people who have some skill sets, because otherwise you're going outside, and that's always a risk to get the right person. And oftentimes, by the time somebody actually says, I'm going to leave in 2 years, it's too late, because you don't have enough of a ramp to develop people if you haven't been developing them so far. Recently, we've been hearing a lot from CEOs this concern about being a lame duck. Like, oh, if I start like identifying potential successors and developing them, are people not going to pay any attention to me as a leader? And I think that's all about a communication process rather than a reality, but it is a concern that we're hearing more and more these days. And then the other big one is like, you know, leaders who really should leave but aren't ready to leave, right? And we see a lot of those. Clint mentioned that I run a program for current and incoming CEOs, and the biggest thing we hear from a lot of the incoming CEOs is like, I've been told that I'm the successor. I'm actually I actually am the president, or I have been appointed to be the CEO, but that last guy won't leave, right? And even though like they're just on the board, like people still go to them, they don't send them back to me, I can't do my job. So sort of that notion of getting out of the way when the time is right is an important one. And then the final challenge is the pressure of responding to the day-to-day client needs. Like that makes it hard for everybody, because they're trying to get product out, or they're trying to deliver services to clients and saying, oh, you should be developing people. While you do that is a different mindset. So you've got to like really shift people's mindset. And of course, if you're experiencing rapid growth, you've got big pressure to hire and promote quickly. And sometimes that's not as thoughtful as it needs to be. So finally, last and least, then I'm going to turn this over to Daniel. Actually, developing a succession system is a multi-step process that begins, as we said, with strategic planning, redesigning roles, knowing your culture, identifying all your key positions, any position that's critical, defining the competencies, so leadership competencies across the board, functional competencies for particular roles, so that you have a sense of kind of what are we going to need, and thinking about the future when you do that. And that's very hard for people because they think about today, right? Here's what I can do, so I need the next person to do. And the question is that plus what, right? Identifying potential candidates that you want to develop or you think might be ultimately at some point successors, assessing their strengths and gaps. How do you do that? And then how do you create a whole development plan for them based on those gaps in particular and on the strengths? How do you give them challenge assignments? How do you give them the leadership competencies they may not have gotten? Because as Daniel said, they got promoted because they were good at their job, not because they have any leadership skills, and so forth. And then finally, tracking progress and making adjustments.
And Jenny,
so lots of steps. Yes.
Lots of steps. So, around here, because of the derecho, we hear a little bit more often that cliche of when's the best time to plant a tree 20 years ago, when's the second best time today. Yeah. It looks like a lot of work. And so if you don't have this in place, just start. And I will say, and my colleague Kathy Terakina, who I did this with in partnership with Jenny, we did not have this 5 years ago, but we do have this today, and it's because we started. So don't get worried or freaked out if this looks like a lot of work. It is. Just get started on it.
Yeah. I guess the last thing I would say, and then I'm going to turn this over to you, Daniel, but the last point I'd make is that you don't have to think that you're ready to leave in order to start building a succession system. It doesn't mean you're leaving. It just means you're being a responsible leader so that your company is protected as much as possible and also has like the greatest leadership capacity you can have. And with that, Daniel, I am going to stop sharing and turn this over to you.
Well, so let's change tack for a moment and addressing some of the introductory remarks. So please don't okay boomer me, because Jamie, I just missed the baby boomer and I think it's 1 year. But I am very concerned about what's called the silver tsunami, and silver because of the silver in the hair of the boomers. There are a lot of baby boomers that own companies that need to transition ownership, and what's going to happen to those companies. And Clint, you mentioned community, and I'm very concerned about community because what's going to happen is if those transitions of ownership take companies out of communities, then that's going to be detrimental to our communities. And so obviously I'm very concerned about Cedar Rapids, but also other communities where we have our companies. And just, it's not Brown Clint, it's Foliance. So I'm going to talk about the difference between ownership and management, because then we're going to talk about transitioning ownership. So ownership is more of that strategic, long-term, shareholders, audit, compliance, all of that. Whereas management is more the day-to-day, the sales, the marketing, the receivables, the customers, contracts. And sometimes what happens is that when the ownership was the management, there comes to be a divide where a lot of family-owned companies, for example, will maintain strategic ownership, but have professional management. And I'm sure that everyone can think of a couple examples here in our community. Some of our biggest companies here in the community, privately held, where the family is no longer in the management, there's professional management, but they have strategic ownership. So what happens when that ownership is ready to transition? What are the risks to transitioning that ownership? And I'm just going to step through a couple models, and I'm going to show the good and the bad of both. So I'm not going to be unfair to any of them. The first one, of course, is if you have a sale to private equity, and there's a lot of this going on right now. There's a lot of liquidity, whether it's liquidity that's built up by institutional investors, ultra high net worth investors, or access to cheap credit. And so there's a lot of money looking to chase deals. And typically what happens in private equity, oftentimes it's a fund structure. You raise money, you go and you look for companies to invest in. And of course, you need to return your investment to investors. And so companies are sold. Now, this can be a great model. The downside is that statistically, within 3 to 5 years, a company that's bought by private equity is typically resold. And that's because to maximize internal rate of return to investors, they need to get that investment harvested within a short time period. And so if you know that your company is going to be bought by private equity and then it's going to be resold in 3 to 5 years, there are some negatives that come from that. Management employees are more likely to leave. That culture that's so important can erode because they know that it may be up for resale again, and competitors can take advantage. So then what's going to happen to the company? Well, again, there are plenty of examples, both positives and negatives. And so I don't say this in a flip way, but do you care? So as a business owner, if you're transitioning ownership, there are some people that really do care about what's going to happen to the employees, to the brand, the legacy, the community, et cetera. And there are other sellers that are just really going to look to maximize what they're getting from that transaction. And so this gets back to what Jenny talks about strategic plan. As an owner, what's your strategic plan as you transition out of that ownership? So another model would be what would be more patient capital. And so, for example, that might be a management buyout. So ownership goes off and you've got great management and they take over managing the company. And that's often a very ideal state. To be fair, what is the risk there? Well, now that management needs to also take care of ownership. And so if they take their eyes off the business to take care of the ownership, and that isn't their core skill set, then there are two risks. One is they've taken their eyes off their business, so it may be more prone to operational risk. And when ownership is not their core skill set, then that may be more prone to compliance risks. So what else do you got for me? Well, everybody in Cedar Rapids knows that I'm CEO of an employee-owned business and I'm an advocate for employee ownership. So I'm going to talk about that for a moment to tell you why that is an interesting possibility, and that's not for every company. So why would you want to possibly consider employee ownership? This data comes from the National Center for Employee Ownership, one of the national associations working with employee ownership. And there's a lot of data that shows that ESOP companies are more likely to stay in business and less likely to lay off employees. And this was proven out during the pandemic. And there's a lot of data on that. They've also shown that there's greater growth. There's greater productivity and greater growth in employee-owned companies. And a lot of this has to do with when the employees are more motivated because they are part owners in the business. They see a very direct line of contribution between their efforts and what they get back as they build up their ownership in the company. And then lastly, some more on return on investment and increased sales. Again, employee-owned companies do have a competitive advantage over non-employee-owned companies, so that might be a future path for the company that you've built up. At Foliance, the way that we're working with this is that we do look for successful companies, and we want to have management continuity. That's one of the criteria for looking at successful companies. And then we bring in that ownership piece so that the managers can just focus on the management of their company. And again, my colleague who's on this call, Kathy Tarakina, has built up our shared services division that brings in support to the company to help with the probability of growth by allowing the companies just focus on their business. And I don't want this to be all about Foliance. So let me give one case example, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what's going on in our community. This was a New York Times article that was out in October, and it talked about this lovely couple who had built a business in Chickasha, Oklahoma. And they actually turned down private equity because they had seen what happened to other trailer companies in Oklahoma that had been bought and then resold by private equity. And they really wanted their company to become employee owned, but they didn't want to have that issue of management taking their eyes off the business. So they were introduced to Foliance, and we acquired their business in 2018, making their employees employee owners. And so it went from Michael and Lynn to, this is actually 2 years ago, that was before COVID. We didn't have a picture during COVID, obviously, of everyone getting together, but those are the proud owners of the company now. And I can tell you that Michael and Len still have that smile on their faces today. They're very happy with the outcome of this. Like I said, in Cedar Rapids, we are not at all the only ones. This was an ad in the Gazette earlier this year. I'm sorry, at the end of last year. And you'll see a lot of very familiar names here: Terracon, Razor, Esco, Nelson, Palmer, the Stark Group, which is a rebrand from Render Connect, Timberline, Van Meter, and there are others. So if you're looking to talk with others who have transitioned from private ownership to employee ownership, feel free to reach out to any of those companies. So in looking at your transition of ownership, I would start with, why did you start your company? What was the purpose for it? Most people don't start a company because they want money. They start a company because they see a need, because they're passionate about something, because they found some great partners to work with. And sure, they then build and acquire wealth through that if they're successful. But what was your purpose? And then go to, so what's your why now? What do you want to happen to that company? Because there are different paths that you can take, and it's not going to be the same one that's appropriate for every company. But what's your why? And then start down that path with the beginning. Begin with the end in mind. It's really the same as what Ginny's been saying on the succession within the company. What do you want that company to become? Do you want to have it stay in the community? Do you want to have the employees continue having that job? Do you want to stay loyal to your brand and legacy? There are different ways to do that. You can do that by passing it to heirs. You can do it by having your management buy out the company. You can convert to employee ownership. You can sell to private equity, to a strategic buyer, but start with your purpose and go to what is your why. And that's what I have on that. And we are right on our schedule. There's nobody in the chat with any questions. Feel free to unmute and ask a question if you'd like, or you can type a question into the chat. if there are specific things that we can respond to. Ginny, you're on mute.
Sorry, there's a comment in the chat from Jennifer. And Jennifer, I wonder if you want to just say that aloud to people. We can put you on.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I work in the career transition business, and we just find that, and I was commenting on your slide about challenges, leaders not ready. It just reminds me of those leaders that may not be making a personal plan for themselves to move towards that next chapter. So they have something to leave behind, but maybe they haven't given any thought to what they're moving towards. So we hear a lot about, you know, my job title, my purpose, my sense of structure, my social connection. If I'm not the CEO, then who am I? And so I think what is beneficial is while they're formulating their own personal plan over a few years, that they're also working on that knowledge transfer piece, developing their successors, etc. So I just wanted to make that comment because that part on your slide, Jenny, kind of stood out for me about leaders just not being ready.
Yeah, you know, and I would agree. I mean, one of the things that we see the most is the leaders that that are able to move up, out, and over, up, over, and out. Are leaders that have other things going on that don't have, like, they've got sort of their next interests in mind, right? And they don't have, they're not struggling with, like, well, who am I if I'm not the CEO of this company? That's been my life, and that's hard for people for whom it has been their life. Trying to figure that out is its own challenge. So Daniel, do you see the question from Dave? Do you want to answer that?
Yeah,
Okay.
so Dave asked, we were told that ESOPs don't usually make sense for businesses below about 10 million in sales and can cost over 100,000 in fees. Do you agree? And so Dave, first of all, I'm going to put in chat a link because Iowa is really progressive with something. The IEDA, the Iowa Economic Development Authority, actually has funds available for companies that are interested in doing a feasibility study as to whether or not you would be a good candidate to become an ESOP. And so if you click on that link, there's up to $25,000 available to companies, and 2 tiers of $12,500 each. And it's really quite progressive. The rest of the country is looking to Iowa at that. But getting back to what you're saying, Dave, it's not so much sales, and there are different people that will give you different numbers. For me, it's really more about profitability and also number of employees. And the reason why is that if you don't have, you know, on 10 million in sales, what's your profitability on that? It could be, you know, close to zero because you have razor margins, or it could be great profitability. If you don't have a company that has good profitability to sustain the ESOP, which is Employee Stock Option Plan, then it's not going to be successful. And the other thing is the number of employees. So I think that the IEDA probably recommends about 25 employees as the absolute minimum and up from there. And the reason why is if you had a company with only 10 employees and 3 of them were to retire at the same time, then basically the rest of the company would have to cash out a third of the value of the company since it's owned by the employees. And that can be really, you know, a huge burden on a company. And so that's where you want to look at the number of employees. There are some other forms of employee ownership, co-ops, for example, that work well for smaller numbers or for lower profitability. And there are plenty of resources out there to look at those. Happy to share those with anyone if they're interested in that. And as far as the fees go, there's also, quite frankly, a misperception that it is certainly not a simple thing that you do in 24 hours to convert a company to an ESOP, but there's also this misperception that it's extremely complicated and extremely costly. And that really is not the case. When you start doing a comparison side by side of the costs of going through really any transaction of somebody buying the ownership of a company, whether it's private equity, strategic, et cetera, or an ESOP, then you start to see that those costs really are very much in line, especially when you look at some of the tax advantages. So for example, if you are the owner of a C Corp and you sell your shares to a ESOP, then there's something called a 1042 exchange, which defers taxation on that. And there are probably others on the call. Clint, I'm sure, knows something about this. I know that John Banks, who is on the call, knows a lot about this. And so that's something which absolutely is something to consider as well.
Daniel, the thing I would add to that is to say, like, there are a range of providers, a range of fees. And the only thing you want to be sure of is that you get advisors who have experience, right? Because it's not, as Daniel says, not all that complicated, but you really need to know what you're doing, right? In terms of setting up ESOPs.
Other questions? Hopefully we'll get some. I'll share a quick story of how not to do it. So in a previous employment, the owner had a good idea about succession and how replaceable employees were, because replaceability is actually a good thing. When you're replaceable, you're single-threaded, and you're that risk that Jenny talked about. And so the owner and a very small segment of the executive team would rate everyone in the firm for their replaceability. Unfortunately, what happened was one year, they inadvertently put that on everyone's end of the year letter where they got told what their bonus was, and they didn't know that it was there until somebody called and said, "Why does my bonus letter say what my percentage replaceability is?" And then they found out that everybody in the firm had gotten that. Not a good way to do succession planning.
Yeah, it's not, certainly not.
Other questions from people about succession planning, about business ownership transition?
I will say, while we're waiting to see if anybody has anything, that we often hear that companies they're nervous about saying, "Oh, I'm developing 2 people for these various roles. Like, isn't that going to be competitive?" And that's why we basically advise companies, like, don't say that to people. Just like do leadership development and make it part of a process and part of your culture. And then nobody thinks more about it. They're like, "Oh yeah, like that's great. They think I have some capacity," without saying, like, "I see you as the next CFO," right? To avoid some of that, potential competitive. I know some people think that competition is good, but generally I haven't seen it be great, because then what often happens, if it feels like a competition, is that the loser leaves, and mostly you don't want that, because you're picking your 2 most talented people at the next level. So,
Bob, you look like you had a question. So some other forms of succession planning that don't work very well. Ginny and I both know this person. Her CEO went off to do some, actually did the program of on CEO development, and came back at the end of the program and sat down with was Sarah vice president at the time, and said, "Well, what I learned from my development program is that I'm getting in the way of this company. So as of this moment, you're now CEO." That's also not a really good way to do CEO succession, even if it's an internal candidate. She has since gone on to become a fantastic CEO.
right. So Cynthia, I see your question in the chat about talking more about leadership development and accountability toward progression of development. Can you tell me just say a little bit more about what you'd like me to talk about there?
It's a wide topic.
Yeah, many owners want to have leadership development for their team and their leadership team,
Right.
and they really don't know what they're looking to accomplish. And so a couple of years down the road, it's like, "Well, I don't think you're ready," or, "You're ready earlier." So it's the progression and the accountability,
Right.
and getting the buy-in and the expectations set to be the same, not only for the company owners, but also for the leadership team. So
Cynthia, the way that we typically approach it, and it's different honestly, for every firm, it's customized to what they want and need and how they operate. But typically what we do is try to get the senior leadership team and the board actually to start by defining what are the leadership competencies that you want any leader to have, and what do those actually look like in action, right? So like, how would we judge whether somebody's got it? And then we take that and we turn it into an assessment tool, right? And we have each functional area adds to it the functional responsibilities. And then they identify kind of who are the people they think might be potential successors, or they do their whole team and they do a little assessment and see kind of who's strong where are the gaps that they've got. And then the leadership development program is often designed around what are the across the board leadership skills people need, and kind of how do we do that in a developmental way over time. And the functional skills are more around the current person in the role, figuring out what are the challenge assignments, who are the people they need to be introduced to, what are the kinds of things that they need to learn to do, and so forth. And Daniel, you could actually talk about that at Foliance. I mean, we've been basically building kind of year on year, like a set of competencies that we think the leaders need. And we started a slightly different way, but it's going to the same place.
And that really gets to anybody in any organization at any level deserves to have some sort of development. And that's difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons. A lot of people, 2/3 of our businesses now are manufacturing. And so you think, why does a welder need development? Well, because work is social. And so when you think about quality, when you think about safety, when you think about innovation and productivity, that's all a social structure. If you hire somebody because of technical skills, if you don't give them that development, then they're not going to be very effective in that social structure. And right now, labor force is shrinking, even though there is still unemployment. Our biggest constraint is going to be access to labor. We all need to have increased productivity and innovation. And that is a social structure. And how do you get that? By developing people, having better communication, better relationships. And that's going to be crucial to any business at any level, whether you're manufacturing, services, administration, production. That's just absolutely crucial. The other thing that I would add is that, and Ginny touched on this with organizational design, every time that we've had the opportunity, and I always do look at it as an opportunity when you need to have succession for somebody that has decided to go on elsewhere, it's usually not replacing one-to-one. It's looking at the organizational design and how can you better distribute responsibilities across a team so that you're not single-threaded, so that it's not dependent just on one person, so that people are working much better together to be more effective in the organization. And so almost all of the succession planning that we've had has led to improvements in that organizational design. Again, what Ginny said, you're here today, but you're planning for where you're going to be. And almost never where you are today is what's going to be the most effective organizational design for where you're headed.
Thank you very much. That's insightful. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here, and we're at the end of our time, so I want to be respectful of that and just say thank you to everybody who's joined us. If you think of questions later on, please send those my direction or Daniel's, and we can get them to the right person. And with that, I just wish everybody a good rest of your week, and stay warm and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Glenn. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Jamie.